We're just going to talk through some of the basics of our collar construction. So here we have our top collar and top collar stand. These are interfaced for stability with an iron-on interfacing which we block fused before we cut out. These two are joined together with a 5mm seam. Now it is the concave edges together that are sewn, so we have to make sure we match the notches with our 5mm seam. Also on our crossover point here with the we have to make sure that the point extends just beyond, so where they cross is our 5mm seam to ensure we have a continuous line at the edge when it folds through. We also have our collar melton. We have two pieces here which are bias cut. So we have a 5mm centre back seam, so right sides together. We will stitch 5mm width of the foot and press that seam open and flat. We then have the French collar canvas. Now this is quite firm to give the collar body. So what I have here is the 5mm seam allowance marked, and we're going to overlap these lines so they sit on top of one another. Then we're going to top stitch down either side to hold this flat in place. A traditional flat open seam wouldn't be suitable here because it would be too thick, and also the nature of the canvas would be quite springy, so the tendency would be that it wouldn't sit flat and it would distort our collar when it's finished. So we're going to sew these pieces together in preparation for our basting and our pad stitch. So we're going to start with our collar melton, our wool felt, which we when we make becomes our under collar. So I'm right sides together, raw edges together, using the width of the foot as a guide because we're going to do a 5mm seam. Back tack for security. And back tack at the end. Trim our thread ends, as always, keeping our work neat as we progress. And as we said, this will then press open flat. There's no need to trim. This is why we got a 5mm seam. We just press that seam open flat. Next, we'll work on the French canvas. This also forms part of the under collar. So as we mentioned earlier, we are overlapping our seam lines instead of right sides together. All the way down, and then we're going to stitch close to this raw edge here, using the inside of the foot as a guide. I'm going to back tack for stability and work our way down. I'm going to trim my ends. Then I'm going to turn the canvas over, and I'm going to do the same on the other side where I have that raw edge, and using the inside foot as the guide, I'm going to stitch to make sure this side also stays flat, and we have the added security then of the seam. So there's our canvas joined together with a flat seam, so there is no bulk, but it is still nice and secure. So next we have the top collar. Now this comprises of the two parts, the top collar and the top collar stand. As we mentioned, the concave shapes go together, so this means that there is ease to go around the curves. So I've pinned and matched my notches first, then either end, and then evenly distributed the ease between and put a pin in the center to help with the stitching. Now if you wish, you can baste this area to help with the ease, or you can just rely on your pins. So again, this is a 5mm seam. Remembering the little triangle, the corner hangs over the underneath, because where they cross at this point here, our 5mm seam is what we're looking for. So the width of the foot is our 5mm as a guide. And as usual, we have our contrast thread for you to see, whereas you would be matching to the colour of your jacket. So take your time as you go around the curve and easing in that volume. It is important you do this as you go. You do not want to be left with it all at one end and just think you can cut it off. This is necessary for the jacket collar to fold and roll around the neck edge. So gently just ease in that volume evenly between the pins. Just taking it steady. Nearly there. All the way around to the other end with our crossover points together, and we back tack. Take out our pins. You can see then how that helps to roll the collar and sit around the neck edge. And there is no visible pleat or packer where we've put in the ease. It's just a nice clean seam. We're now going to layer together our under collar. So we have our melton. Then we're going to put a piece of bias cut pocketing in the ends of the collar. This is to add extra firmness and shape in this area. We are then going to put our French collar canvas on top. And we're going to baste all those layers together. So I've basted through all the layers to hold them in place. Then on the side of the canvas, I've marked a 1cm allowance all the way around as a border, because I don't want a pad stitch right to the edges. I've also then marked a semicircle. My diameter here is 8 centimeters. So from this point up is 4 as a radius. On the notes, I think the example given is 5, but of course this would depend on the depth of your collar. So I've gone just over halfway as a guide to our circumference of our circle. We would start by pad stitching this area first, then we would progress to the outer areas, only pad stitching to our pencil line that we've marked. When we come to the ends of our collar, we are going to then bend them forward, so we're going to turn our collar over, and we are then going to pad stitch the ends. This is as we did on the lapel. So this creates a natural curve for the collar to tilt and lie towards the body rather than curling up away from the body. So we'll do that on both ends of the collar. Once we've done that, we'll just put it back to our pattern to make sure there's been no distortion with our pad stitching and it is stretched. Trim back to pattern and then trim back our canvas and pocketing away from the melting edge so they don't poke through when we attach it to the jacket. I'm working with a melton that already comes stitched with the canvas just to speed the process on a little bit, and hopefully you can see where I've trimmed back the canvas now away from the edge. Once that process has been done, all the pad stitching, and we've rechecked back to pattern and trimmed, I've now marked on the pattern the roll line of the undercollar. What I'm going to do then is fold it over to the right side and baste. So I'm going to put a pin in the centre just to make sure it doesn't twist because we are on a little bit of a curve. And then I'm just going to gently fold that over how it naturally wants to lie. And then we're going to baste into position. Just going through all the layers. So the roll line is where the undercollar naturally breaks when it sits around the neck of the jacket. There is a slight curve here, so there might be a little bit of distortion. We're okay. Everything we're doing now is to help the collar sit nicely around the neck and over the shoulders comfortably. So what we're going to do now, with quite an excessive amount of steam, we're going to start to bend and set the collar in a curved position. The distance and the depth of the curve we are looking at for is about 5 centimeters from this point. So if we had an imaginary straight line, the center would go up 5 centimeters. I'll go and press that, and then we can have a look at the difference in the collar shape. So it naturally wants to fall into the curve shape after we've basted when we steam into position. Then with our straight line, point to point, we then in the center have our 5 centimeters of a curve. We're now ready to join the under collar and the top collar together. So I've chalk marked the 5mm seam allowance along this top edge of the collar. I've also put chalk marks where the notches and the ends of the under collar should sit. I don't want to snip into this allowance to mark the notches, it's only 5mm. On the under collar, I've unpicked my basting, and then at the ends, for about 7 centimeters, I've pressed out the crease that we put in to create the curve. The crease is still there in the center, it's just at either end. Then we're going to overlay the under collar felt on top of the fabric collar. matching the notches. So the first one I have here is the end of the collar. So this will sit on top to the line that I've chalked and round to the first notch. We will then continue this all the way around, matching the centre back and to the other end. This is done with a zigzag stitch, which encloses all the raw edges of the felt, and that is why we've trimmed back the canvas, because we didn't want this to show. So we've now attached with the zigzag the under collar to the top collar. As you can see, the zag stitch is quite condensed to enclose the raw edge of the melton. This then creates at the fold line of the under collar, so it is not seen when worn. There is some ease in the centre back area, so make sure you take the time to ease that in and match the notches at the front. So what we do now with the jacket that we've already put together, from our notch here, from our facing attach, we're going to chalk mark around the neck edge a centimetre seam allowance. And then using the same principle, we place the raw edge of the felt to the centimetre line, and then we zag that into position, matching our notches on our shoulder point and also our centre back neck. And then the under collar will be attached to the jacket. So we've zag stitched and overlaid the melton onto the jacket, following that centimetre line we had chalked, matching shoulder notches and centre back neck. When we're doing this, we need to make sure that the facing is out of the way and not attached. Also, I've pinned the collar, the chest canvas out of the way, so we're not catching that around the neck either. The next stage is to attach this section of the collar to the top of our lapel. It is quite a fiddly thing to do because we're starting the seam and ending right here where we've snipped in for the lapel notch. So that's our centimetre seam, so we're going there across. So to do this, we're turning our lapel back through to the wrong side. So this is why when we basted, we didn't go across the top. So now I have my centimetre seam allowance. I'm then going to pin my top collar, remembering the overlap that we have to do with the point so that it crosses over at our centimetre seam allowance. I'm not going to use that pin because it had a buckle in it and I want to be able to stitch over my pins. So then we would have a notch to where our collar should end, which lines up with the end of the lapel. Yeah, so notch and end of lapel. Just got to move it down a little bit. There we go. There might be some ease. This is due to the collar area along here being on a bias. So make sure you evenly distribute the ease. Now I find it easier to start from the edge of the lapel and work into the collar notch rather than trying to come from the collar notch out. So we've got to make sure we don't catch anything else as we do this process. As I say, it is a little bit fiddly. You can alternatively do it by hand, but we're trying to be a little bit more commercial here and machine attach the collar. So I have my centimetre seam allowance and back tack. Support the weight of the jacket on the machine table so we're not having any drag and pulling on the area we want to sew. So make sure our raw edges are together. The seam underneath of our stand to collar attach needs to be flat and open as we stitch over it. All the while as we're stitching, we're making sure the underneath is clear. It's only these two layers we are catching together and nothing else. So I'm just going to fold the seam allowance on the top of the lapel out of the way, because I'm hoping to get as close as I can into that snipped edge. And back tack. Just going to trim the ends. This seam would then be pressed flat and open, and we turn it through to the right side. Where we've pressed the seam flat and open, we'd continue that to the edges of the collar. This then folds back on itself, creates a little bit of strength there at the end, and also neatens this raw edge here. So this is hand stitched into place, slip stitch top and bottom, and a double cross stitch at the end to hide the raw edge there, whereas the other two are folded edges. And then that is our collar onto our jacket body.